This was the quote from Nancy Pelosi. I mean, this is not how I anticipated starting our conversation, but I just think we're having fun right now. So, in the New Yorker today, Pelosi said about Biden, "I've never been that impressed with his political operation," she admitted. "They won the White House, bravo. But my concern was, this ain't happening, and we have to make a decision for this to happen. The president has to make a decision for that to happen." So, like, that's amazing to see because you, Josh, have long been critical of Biden as a politician. His political acumen has been overstated in your estimation. Can you give a sense of why you feel that way and why someone like Pelosi may feel that way?
Yeah, there's my dog went into the background. You can say hi to
You're
her,
good.
everybody. Yeah.
Hi.
I don't know why she went exactly in the camera, but hello. We see you.
She's so sweet.
Yeah, she's the best. But yeah, that was very vindicating to read because like I had, and like this was kind of like the through line that I followed for basically a year. I had always been kind of agnostic towards like the Biden administration, like following politics, like with the 2022 midterms, and after that, I didn't think they were like particularly like great master politicians, but I didn't like see them as particularly inept either. Like I was willing to sort of believe that their low approval ratings was just because of inflation that was out of their control. I didn't really like how they handled Congress, but they passed those bills. This was before October 7th. So like their foreign policy record was Ukraine, which was like give or take, like I guess that was an accomplishment. But then I got this book around the middle of 2023 called The Last Politician by Franklin Foer, and it was a very like kind of like positive book towards him. It was one of these Biden biographies that they published like around 2023 that like they actually like sold very poorly, which is why we haven't seen Biden biographies lately, but like which is a little disappointing. I'd like one over like the past couple of weeks, but hopefully that'll come eventually. Pelosi actually did say she would write a book about the past month or so, which I'm really looking forward to. I hope she stays around for that.
Me too.
But yeah, but this book basically was supposed to be, the thesis of it was that we live in this era of gridlock where the politicians are kind of just showmen and like just fodder for the parties, and people just went off of polarization and everybody just wants to become celebrities. But Biden is, as in the words of the title, the last politician, and he has this ancient like lost art of politics skill set that he uses to get things done that people considered impossible. And I just kind of skimmed through it, and I went to the part about the 2022 midterms, which is where the race like sort of ends. And I was curious as to like kind of how he said they thought about it. And what I read was really alarming because what like they said wasn't like, oh, this was about abortion, this was about Republicans being too extreme. They saw the 2022 midterm results as a vindication of them, like literally their administration. They thought people were voting for Democrats in like Michigan and Pennsylvania that year, not because they were running against insane abortion fanatics or people who want like people to have to get children after being raped. They thought it was because like people appreciated them being more moderate on abortion. Like you may remember that Elizabeth Warren pushed for like using federal land to set up abortion clinics. They explicitly rejected that, and they thought that the reason they won was because they rejected that. They took personal credit for these like victories that other Democrats did that happened in spite of them.
But
like
his
that was
approval
their
rating was super low, and everyone, and you, this is why people need to subscribe to your newsletter. Like my predictions about this election would not have been as good if I hadn't been reading your work. Like truly, you do the work on this. Like Biden's approval rating was low at this point.
Yeah, it was.
It didn't recover after the Afghanistan withdrawal. I mean, who knows if that's causal? I don't think it is. I think it was just more like, you know, the COVID benefits and like the child tax credit began to expire, and there were no more stimulus checks and things like that, and people's purchasing power was affected. Like rent has never been higher in this country. So I think a lot, and his inability to like lead, and then eventually, of course, the support for the genocide. But
yeah,
how did those numbers not translate when we're seeing like generic Democrat polling much better than Biden, specifically his approval rating being low, and yet his team was somehow convinced that it was his politics and policies driving the success for Democrats?
Yeah, it got to really absurd extents. Like they took credit after Andy Beshear won. Like in 2023, like Andy Beshear won his race after he led in polling the entire time and was expected to win. They said, oh, you guys like never expected Democrats could do well, and we just won more elections. Like they held the state legislator in Virginia and they won the Kentucky's governor's race. The Kentucky's governor's race was because Kentucky had like a bunch of tornadoes and a cave-in, and Bashir was there, and people thought that he was like a strong leader for natural disasters. It had nothing to do with Biden at all, but they were taking credit for these things, and it was just setting up this kind of like storybook narrative about how like this kind of superstition about how they were always underestimated, how they always came back, that wasn't based on any like empirical data at all. It was just this kind of shoddily crafted, disingenuous sort of thing. And it was really concerning to me because I thought they were just like trying to just cover for like something that was really concerning there with something that wasn't convincing. But from what we've seen since he dropped out, they may have like sincerely just not have believed in polling. Like supposedly they hadn't conducted internal polls for months. When they got the polling data showing how badly they were running in all of these states that like everybody else was seeing for weeks at that point, it was news to them. Like according to like what the reporting is on this. Like this, they weren't aware that they were like on track to actually lose. They told themselves after the 2022 midterms that polling was wrong, which it wasn't. Polling that year was correct. The punditry was wrong. Like the polling actually did show Democrats winning in all the states that they won and having a close race for the House. It never showed that. It never showed a red wave. That was just pundits overthinking it and over kind of assuming stuff about the election. But like the Biden people created this narrative that was part of this larger kind of narcissistic narrative around Biden's larger life story about how he's always been counted out and how he always comes back. And it just like created this kind of like castle of superstition and just like disingenuity that they lived in. And it like eventually you saw it like it was not, I mean, it probably could have been sustainable, which is the scary part. It took the earliest debate in history for it to really like kind of like for push to come to shove. But it did, so thank God for that.
So can you reconcile the fact that Kamala Harris is running like very successfully right now, in part, though, I think just due to the fact that she is the generic Democrat that we've been hoping for,
something
right?
Closer to that. I don't think she's exactly that. I do think, like, right now, like, I still have my doubts about Kamala. I don't think she was the ideal candidate. I had my list that I made of all the prospective candidates, and she was closer to the bottom because she's never been particularly popular. She's not electorally proven in the way that pretty much every other Democrat was. It was interesting following the Veep stakes because you had all these contenders for the number 2 position, and across the board, they all had far more successful records for president and for running a presidential campaign than Kamala herself did. Like you had Shapiro, who won by 17, 15 points in Pennsylvania. You had Kelly, who won back-to-back victories in Arizona. Walz won in a red district for 10 years, and he won 2 elections in a purplish state. Like Bashir won in Kentucky. Like all of these contenders had more solid, proven records at the ballot box than Kamala does. And I think there is still something of a gap between how she's polling and how someone like Bob Casey or Tammy Baldwin or Ruben Gallego is polling. But that gap has narrowed because the difference between her and one of those more generic Democrats is a lot less. It's not as wide of a difference as it was between with Biden between them. Because with Biden, there was a very, very strong question of competence that he just could not get over. You had 85% of the public thinking he was too old to do the job. I do think that going back to what the cause of his disapproval was, I personally do see the Afghanistan collapse as a turning point because he had his reputation that he kind of traded off of in 2020 was that he was this elder statesman, very experienced figure who could get things working again. And that did not that was what people were hopeful about. And then you have this foreign policy debacle happen under him. And that really takes the sheen off and it paints everything else in a very poor light. So this old person with a record of failure, people don't think can run, is going to be stuck. And his numbers were very, very stagnant against Trump, which was the scary part. For about a year after October 7th, his numbers were consistently behind Trump's. With Kamala, there's more kind of people are I don't think they're necessarily settled on her, but there's the perceptions of her are not nearly as baked in as something as solid as this person is too old and they're not getting any younger. People have concerns about Kamala not having accomplishments. They have concerns about her not being experienced or maybe being too liberal, and which probably is just derived more from like her persona and her background than it is her actual policy statements. But like that's more malleable, and that people can like kind of brush those concerns aside a lot more easily than they could have with age. So we're kind of like the better version of somebody running with the Biden record. It's not exactly the ideal you would see for a Democrat totally disconnected from that record, which I personally always saw as the ideal. But like you're getting rid of a lot of difficulties that were impossible to get rid of with Biden, and it's just that might be enough. It looks like could be enough. It looks like that will be enough.
Right. And to your point, if it was someone completely disconnected from the unpopularity of the Biden administration, we'd have a very different race as it relates to Israel and Palestine and what she's dealing with right now, even though in the end, I think it's difficult for us to understand how little I think a lot of voters like have that affect them. But I am curious though, like, you talk about how the Biden campaign didn't believe in polling. Harris inherited that entire campaign infrastructure, and Jen O'Malley Dillon stayed on as one of the top people on that campaign. Can you just define the difference between Biden's like extremely old and associated with the family inner circle versus the campaign infrastructure, and why Harris has been able to use that same campaign infrastructure to have much more success?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's necessarily because of her campaign infrastructure. I wrote about this in an article I published earlier this week, kind of laying out how she could win. And it's just for as successful as her rollout has been, I think that's more of just a fact of the circumstances than a fact of her accomplishments or the accomplishments of her campaign. She is getting a positive reception right now, partially because she has delivered good speeches and like press the case in a way that's compelling to people and gets attention. But it's fundamentally she is giving people what they want. What people have always wanted this year was a younger, new figure to bring the country past the Biden-Trump years of really old people who they regard as failures on either side. This wasn't necessarily related to ideology. They would be happy with a younger liberal. They would have been happy with a younger conservative. You had Shapiro leading Trump by 10 points in Pennsylvania. You had a Haley leading Biden by 20 points nationally, I think, in one poll. People just fundamentally wanted like just a new figure. And she's not the perfect example of that because she's the sitting vice president, but she is that to a far greater degree than Biden was. So it's people kind of, I think her success has been people kind of reading in what they want to believe about her because people are so desperate for like a sense of hope. They're willing to give her like a benefit of the doubt. Moderates will look at her and kind of see, oh, this is like kind of like a moderate liberal figure, like that I can get behind. Left-wing people will look at her and like see her as somebody who may be more sympathetic to their concerns than Biden was and has a more kind of like a better background than him, like as like this 50-year corporate senator. It'll be tricky for her to kind of, I don't know, like, I mean, I don't know if it'll necessarily be impossible to thread that needle or for it to even really be hard. People just kind of want her to be what they want her to be so badly now that I think she'll get a lot of leeway. But, we haven't really seen the rubber hit the road in terms of like her having to make like big campaign decisions. And I can't say I'm too enthusiastic with how she's kept that team together. There's some really crazy anecdotes that I read that show that pretty much anything could be an improvement just to return to a basic campaign organization. I think there was a story that Mike Donilon, one of Biden's like many senior advisors, was essentially the entire ad team himself. They wrote that like he would come up with ideas for ads on his own. He would pitch it to some guy, and then they would use like this $300 million campaign. They would just make the ads based off of what this one guy thought of.
Like, they'd also spent like no money on ads in the lead up to, I mean, they were trailing. Sorry. They did in all the swing states, but it was, I think, digital that they weren't. And that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's this old guy.
Nothing on Facebook. That was like a big difference.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.